Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the formal launch of Work Disability Management System Standard. My name is Emin Yazdani. I am the Director of Canadian Institute for Safety, Wellness, and Performance, hosted at Conestoga College's School of Business. And we are excited to be hosting this session today. I'm pleased to introduce our key partner organizations for this webinar. Center for Research on Work Disability Policy and Canadian Standard Association Group. Our speakers today are myself, Dr. Emil Tampa from Center for Research on Disability Policy, Candace Seller from CSA Group, and Dr. David Brown from CIBC. Here's the agenda for today's webinar. We will start with Candace to take you over the standard development process at CSA. Then Dr. Tampa and I will provide a broad overview of the standard. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to send it through the QA tab at the bottom of your player. We will be answering questions at the end of the session. If you do not get to your questions during today's webinar, we will be sure to follow up afterwards. At the end, I will provide a closing remark and announce future webinars. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our first speaker, Candace Seller from CSA. Candace, over to you.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're located in our wonderful country. I'm here to present today on the Worker and Public Safety Standards Development Team and our standards development process at CSA Group. Do I have the ability? I'm into it. There we go. For those of you that are on the call, CSA Group is probably a familiar organization. We're very member driven. We have over 10,000 volunteer members. And quite globally relevant. We participate not only in standards development activities in Canada, but binationally as well as internationally. The Canadian influence is felt and heard and greatly influences how standards are developed on the international level. We have over 12 different areas of focus at CSA Group, which includes 54 different technology areas. It's probably higher than that now. And over 3,000 standards, including the electrical code and other various codes like the gas code, and over 1,000 technical committees. So any given day, there's quite a number of volunteer members meeting and discussing everything around you in your life in some way or another is touched by our standards. So we can move slides. So CSA not only develops standards, but we also have guidance materials, and it's developed through our accredited standards development process. This is accredited by the Standards Council of Canada. So every year they come out and they audit us to make sure that we're following our rules, our directives. And on top of doing the standards, we also do technical guides, handbooks, which quite often are implementation guidance material, workshop agreements, express documents, and private standards. The last three are not accredited, but quite often they do lead to a final output of an accredited standard. So why do organizations and governments adopt standards? Why are they even important? Well, the average Canadian has no clue. And I say that with all due respect. I didn't until I started at CSA 13 years ago. We use a consensus-based approach, and it's very unique to Canada. We make sure that there's enough voices at the table representing all the sectors and all the different categories of stakeholder, that their voices get heard. It's not a pay-to-play based standards development system that you see in other countries. It's very much a Canadian approach. And our staff don't write the documents. We don't try to unduly influence the technical content of the documents. We facilitate the accredited process and make sure that everything is flowing properly through that process. The standards are quite often evidence-based, and they're supported by our research program, which is, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years in the running now. And it's a less expensive approach. Like the Treasury Board is actually done studies and made recommendations to different levels of government to really use the Canadian standards development system to address different policy challenges that they may have. There's also increased flexibility when you're not relying necessarily on regulatory reform. You can pivot and address things in a more rapid basis, relatively speaking, of course. We also have a minimum required to review our standards every 5 years. So every 5 years, we have to, our technical committees have to decide if the content is still technically relevant. Is there a need to update it? Is there a need to reflect new technology changes, new performance tests, whatever it might be? So they're evergreening documents, and there's a lot of value to be said in that. They're written in a way to allow for innovation, not to block trade, and it promotes harmonization internationally. Quite often, the first step we do in any kind of standard development activity is to look to our international partners and say, do you have anything? And we take that content into account in the Canadian context. Sometimes we adopt the international guidance, and sometimes we amend it to make it more relevant to the Canadian situation. So the Worker and Public Safety Standards Program, which oversees all of the OSH standards, including the Workplace Disability Management System standard. We're a small group. There's one program manager, myself, 4 project managers, a standards intern, and an AA. And not only do we oversee all of the OSH standards in Canada, but we also oversee the public safety standards. So the first, to give you a bit of context, CSA Group has been around for more than 100 years, and the first general OSH standard was published in 1948. So it's been more than 70 years that we've been at it. Not me personally, I'd be very tired. There's over 59 active technical committees and 1,800 volunteer members within this program area, and we have well over 150 standards. And more importantly, over 50% of those standards are referenced in regulation by the various authorities having jurisdiction. So most people know that standards are voluntary unless referenced, so that there's a lot of value in those documents, and that's being recognized by our regulatory partners through CALOSH, which, for those that don't know, CALOSH is the Canadian Association of Administrators of Labor Legislation, Occupational Safety and Health, and they represent the various labor regulators from the provincial, territorial, and federal government. So you can see from this screen, this was intended just to give you a wide lens of the different areas that are underneath the OSH program. And you can see the Disability Management System Standard actually fits under 2 of the themes. It follows the OSH Management System Standards approach. You'll see the Plan, Do, Check, Act framework, and Amin and Emil and David will touch on that. But it's also part of our worker wellness portfolio. And it's important because a lot of people have not necessarily in Canada, but maybe beyond, have not made the connection between worker wellness and safety, which to us as Canadians is pretty intuitive. So we've been working very hard over the last 4 years to really grow our wellness portfolio, working on the psychological health and safety, substance-related impairment, the care inclusive worker fatigue, and now the disability management system. Next slide, please. So as I said, there's a national standards system that is overseen by Standards Council Canada. The process is open and inclusive. The members develop the content and the decisions are made by consensus. And I'll have a few slides on consensus a little later. But the important thing to remember for us is consensus does not necessarily represent unanimity. It means that you have to have more than a simple majority, but it doesn't mean that everybody's going to be 100% happy with the document at all times. They're voluntary unless referenced in regulation. And quite often, I noted earlier that we participate in international standards development activity, and a document such as this, Z1011, which is pretty much a leading document of its kind, is the type of document we would consider down the road for submitting to the to ISO for consideration for international adoption. A lot of people don't know that Canada has been a significant leader in influencing some of the more progressive standards that are happening on the international scene. Next slide, please. So we have our directives, and geez, this is like a 2-day course to go through the directives. I'm not going to go through it today, but the first part of our directives defines our rules around participants and organizational structure. The second part is all about the development process, and I'll have a slide on the development process stages in a few minutes. The third part is on the actual drafting of standards. Every word in the standards and even how you go about dispositioning comments and shall, should, and mays, there's a lot of discussion that goes into that. And our last part, of course, is on the CSA American National Standards process, because we're also accredited down in the US by ANSI. So this is how the structure of CSA generally works. At the top of it, you can see the CSA Group Board of Directors. Underneath that, the Standards Development Council, who oversee the standards piece. The Board of Directors actually oversees the whole of CSA Group, which not only includes the standards development piece, but it includes our corporate business, as well as our testing, inspection, and certification arm. Underneath the Standards Development Council, you'll see strategic steering committees. And in the Worker and Public Safety program area, we have two. We have an OSH strategic steering committee, and we have a public safety strategic steering committee. And they help us in determining the business direction, the standards needs, and ensuring that CSA is creating standards that are valuable to the Canadian marketplace and adding real solutions. The technical committees fall underneath that, and the technical committees are responsible for the approval of technical content. In some situations, they may also be the drafting body, but there's other cases where the technical committee oversees a series of technical subcommittees. And the technical committee has a balanced matrix, and I will explain to you in a few minutes what that means. And it's a similar idea for the subcommittees. It doesn't have a formal balanced matrix requirement, but we try to make sure it is as close to balanced at all times as possible. And then, of course, we have ad hoc task groups that come in and advise and work on specific granular issues. They're formed, they fulfill a function, and then they're disbanded once the solution is arrived at. They're not a standing committee. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a balanced matrix. So the total membership is maintained in terms of the relevant stakeholder interest categories, not by affiliations. So the important thing to remember is the membership actually belongs to the individual and not the organization, although they do represent the organizational category. So each category has a minimum and maximum number of voting members. We can't exceed that, and we can't fall underneath that. And we need to ensure that all points of view are represented in a reasonable proportion, and that that portion is maintained at all times. And the project managers go through the membership at the beginning of every meeting and with the executives to ensure that we maintain that. As you can see on the right-hand side, that's the CSA Z1011 technical committee as of last week. And in this particular case, we're balanced. None of the categories drop below the min. And in some cases, you can drop below the min as long as the two smallest categories don't exceed the size of one largest category. So you can tell there's a little bit of math involved in this process. This is the core of what we do. This is the CSA standards development process. And it's important to note that the request for a new standard can come in from anyone. It can come in from those of you on the call. It can come in from the regulator. It can come in from the standards board. It can come in from the steering committee. It can come in from an employer or an association group. And it can also be triggered, unfortunately, by coroner's inquest. And once the request for a standard or an update to a standard is evaluated and we figure out how to resource it, then it's assigned to a committee, which is the second stage. From there, we put out what's called a notice of intent. It's put out on the CSA website, as well as the Standards Council of Canada website, that there's going to be a new standard developed. And this is a critical stage because it allows other SDOs, standards development organizations, to have a voice if they feel that they've already got the content covered under another document, or to discuss opportunities for collaboration, whatever it might be. The fourth box has meetings and a draft. That should actually be the size of the whole screen, because that's where the heart and the blood and the sweat and the tears go into this process. This is where all of the members come together and they meet for months and months, both in person and virtually. Well, I say in person during normal non-COVID times, and they work on the content of the standard. So they reach a point where they believe it's about 95% good to go, and it's put out for public review. The public review stage, CSA has a public review portal that anybody can sign up to. So that when we have standards that come out under OSH or come out under public safety or electrical code, whatever it might be, you get an automatic alert that that document is out there and it's ready for you to review. So that's your opportunity for anybody that's not on the committee to provide input into the draft standard. And that input doesn't just fall into a void, it's reviewed, it's considered by the committee, and it's dispositioned. After the public review stage, the TC works towards developing consensus. So they disposition the comments and it's moved on to our pre-approval edit stage, which is very comprehensive now because we have multiple factors to consider. We have to consider English, we have to consider French. With both documents, we have to consider the accessibility of the documents, both in printed form and in view access form. From there, we go on to technical content approval, which is the final technical committee vote. And when this is the committee's last opportunity to say, yes, I support this document, no, I don't support this document, or yes, I support it, but I'd still like to see a few minor changes. Then CSA has a bunch of internal processes, procedural approval to ensure that we're following our documented process for when we get audited. And then final edit and publication, which actually also can be quite a lengthy process to get it into the proper systems and formatted and address any IT issues in the operability of some of the more virtual documents. In terms of dissemination and maintenance, those should also be huge processes. CSA, through activities such as this webinars, speaking at conferences, providing Q&A documents, whatever it might be, we work to disseminate the news that the standard is out and available. We work with the regulators on a monthly basis to make them aware of what new documents are out and to discuss their needs and if they're interested in referencing it. So there is effort that goes into that stage. And then of course the maintenance stage. A lot of people think that there's not a lot of activity during the maintenance stage, but there is. This is another opportunity for the end users, such as yourselves, to take a document, in this case, a brand new document, and put it to use. And to come back to us with any questions that you may have about areas maybe where we weren't as clear as we could have been. We call that a request for formal interpretation. And those requests for formal interpretation get published as part of the standard. We also have other activities that may happen during maintenance, such as errata. And a lot of committees also spend the time monitoring technical and different kinds of updates and evidence that's coming out that could support the need for a second edition or an update on the document. So that's the cycle, and you can see it's pretty comprehensive and it's pretty time tested in our case. So there's lots of different opportunities around that for individuals to participate in the process, even if you're not a member of the committee. So how can you get involved? Through membership, by participating on a committee. When you monitor our sites, calls from members come out. You can also proactively just put in a membership application and indicate different standards and areas that you're interested in. Through direct input at public review or throughout the maintenance phase. Through our work with different research partners and academia, as well as by joining our community. So we have the CSA Occupational Health and Safety Community Space, and it's on the CSA General Community Space. And it's used by, we just hit 100,000 users of this space, I think it was last week. And the OSH space tends to be one of the, it always goes between first and second for the most high traffic used space. And it's a place where you can post questions and you can follow all the different activities of the OSH program. So that in a nutshell is our process. And I want to thank everybody on the Z1011, Amin, Emil, David, and all the other members for making this happen.
Okay, thank you, Candice. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Emil Tampa to talk about the standard that we're talking about, the Work Disability Management System Standard. Emil, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Amin. Yes, so I'm going to give you a high-level overview about the motivation for developing this standard. And then Amin's going to give a deeper dive into the nitty-gritty of what's actually in the standard document and the guidance that's provided there. So just reiterating the key partners that were involved in this development of the standard: Conestoga College, where Amin is based, the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, where I am based, and the CSA Group, obviously, which is the standard development organization. So on this slide, I have some details about the kind of expertise that was involved in the technical committee that developed this standard. Myself, I chaired the committee, and we had two vice chairs, Amin Yazdani and David Brown, both of who are with us at this webinar. And then the CSA project managers were Lena Lopez, who was with us as well, and David Shanahan, who actually recently retired. There was also about 25 voting members and several non-voting members. I haven't got them listed here. This is quite a long list, 25 plus. They are listed in the actual CSA document as well. So if you purchase that document, you will see the list of all the people who are involved on the technical committee that developed this standard. It covered a diverse range of expertise, a very broad range from different stakeholder groups. A lot of expertise in this technical committee. I was really impressed with the years of experience that some of these people had working in various facets of the work disability policy system here in Canada. We had some employer representatives, some people representing various labor or union groups. We had injured worker and disability representatives as well. Health and safety professionals. We had a number of people who were specialists in return to work issues, experts in work disability prevention, and also some representation from workers' compensation and other disability insurance programs, as well as myself and Amin and others who have academic expertise who specialize in the research and evidence base around work disability prevention. Next slide, please. Okay, so just what is the problem? Why did we develop this standard? So I have some numbers here. They're hard to fathom. When I find myself, when I get into numbers that are trillions of dollars, it's hard to put some boundaries to what that actually means, but this just gives you some sense of that. So annually, the cost of work disability is estimated between $1 and $2 trillion worldwide. That's a yearly cost, and I'm guessing it's very highly underestimated. In Canada alone, this is some work that I've been involved in with ESDC. We estimated that the cost of excluding people with disabilities from full participation on various social domains, not just work, amounts to about 17.6% of GDP annually. The work part of it, the productivity and output losses in industry alone is about 3.2% of GDP annually. So huge numbers we're talking about. And these numbers are going to go up if we don't address it. You know, when we think about chronic and episodic disabilities, they're on the rise as the labor force ages. Mental health issues are on the rise as well, you know, for a variety of reasons. So as well as there's very high levels of unemployment amongst people with disabilities, simply because workplaces, employers are challenged on how do you accommodate people's health needs in a meaningful way to keep them engaged and productive. And current practices for work disability prevention management is quite varied. You know, they're piecemeal. They're often not based on an organizational wide approach. And so I would describe that as being very, you know, reactive, right? So, so this standard has been developed as a consensus-based framework to help organizations manage work disability in a more proactive way. It addresses both physical and mental health needs of workers, whether they're work-related or not work-related. So it's quite comprehensive in scope in addressing all worker health needs. And in fact, it also includes guidance on recruitment, hiring, and onboarding of workers with disabilities. So it really addresses the health needs of workers right at the front end when they're first coming on board, right through over the life course till the point they exit to retirement or wherever else they might go. It really is a life course perspective that it's taking of the workers' health needs with that organization. And we also in the document, for the standards document, provide some supporting materials, including some implementation tips that are in an appendix at the end of it. So we put in some materials that will help organizations with the implementation of this standard. And we felt some of these tips were really important to include there. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this slide. Oh, okay, so no, this is good. Thanks. I mean, okay, so we take a systems approach, and by systems I mean, you know, a broader kind of management systems approach, because traditionally the approach taken for work disability issues was often very piecemeal. It was often assigned to a particular person. So there would be maybe a disability manager in a large organization that had the sole responsibility with dealing with disability issues. Sometimes it's assigned to the human resources department or an occupational health and safety department or manager, really thought of as a person's role. In fact, some organizations even farm it out to external organizations or service providers. These are very reactive approaches. They deal with the absences when they arise rather than in thinking about how can we prevent disability in a proactive way. Whereas the systems approach really focuses on proactively addressing work disability. It considers the roles and responsibilities across the organization, and everybody plays some role in these kinds of systems. And thinking about how do we identify what those roles are. It considers inputs, the processes, the outputs, and the feedback that ensures that we have continual improvement in the system. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a management system? I get asked this question a lot when I talk about this standard and other management system standards that are provided by the CSA Group. It's not familiar to everybody. What we mean by management systems, it's a formalized framework that has policies, processes, and procedures that are used by the organization to meet all of the organization's objectives. You know, it's based on a documented and tested step-by-step methods that really are aimed at smooth functioning through standard practices. And audits are a really critical part of the process as well, because we want to ensure continual improvement. So ideally, organizations have frameworks in all of these areas of their core activities, including work disability management. So that's why we felt this standard was really important to have, because there was prior to this standard no work disability management standard in Canada or internationally. So it's really a first of its kind. It takes a systems approach to work disability management to really ensure that there's clarity and consistency and that it's integrated with all of the organizational activities. So it's meant to be proactive and really addressing health needs before they become disabling. And that's why we use the word work disability prevention sometimes. So the management systems model, I'm going to, over the next few slides, just go through what we mean by that. Thank you, Amin. Okay, so it starts off with policies. We setting clear direction for the organization to follow. Then we put in those management structures, making sure they're in place for delivering those policies. There's a planning component and ensuring that there's a systematic approach to implementing those policies. And then we get into the measurement of performance. We know performance is really measured against the targets that were set and identifying any areas that there might be need for improvement. And then the last one is about learning from those experiences. How did we do? Did we reach our targets? Where is there room for improvement? Applying those lessons in the next round of setting new targets in that continual improvement process. So next slide. So that's often framed as a PDCA kind of process, plan, do, check, act. So planning where you're establishing the improvement objectives, you're doing that through implementing that plan. The checking where you're monitoring and evaluating your progress. The acting part of it where we're reviewing and taking action to make improvements for the next cycle so that you go back up to number one again. You go through that cycle on a periodic basis. And then I'll pass that on to Amin from here.
Thank you, Emil. So what I will be doing in the next 10-15 minutes, I'll try to walk you through some of the important features of this standard. This is going to be one of the first of its kind standards that addresses the issues of work disability management. It is a broad framework to help organizations to also facilitate the integration of work disability management practices with other organizational activities. The standard has that capability to be integrated to other Canadian or international standards, including the Health and Safety Management System standard, psychological health and safety, and even topics that they are not related to health and safety in general, issues around quality management. There are a lot of research evidence suggesting the integration of health and safety activities into a broader management framework, into a broader topics and other business drivers that they ultimately receive adequate attention that they deserve. So it provides a systematic approach and an organization-wide strategy to address work disability at organizational level. It involves senior management and tries to build collaboration between different stakeholders within organizations to work together and to feel responsible in engaging in a dialogue that could result in prevention of work disability issues at organizational level. It uses common language and terminologies that could possibly help facilitate the implementation where in some occasions, usually we see in health and safety domain that the terminologies we use, the language we use is not widely accepted or widely recognized by other stakeholders within organizations. This standard aims to promote proactive approaches toward work disability, looking at highlighting the importance of organizational strategy to addressing this issue before the onset of work disability. The work disability management may include strategies to accommodate workers in order to prevent unnecessary absences or early and safe return to work when health absences occur. We should be focusing on a continuum from primary to secondary to tertiary prevention, as this approach is known to be the most effective strategy. And that is what we're trying to do within this standard, to make sure that that continuum of activities are implemented within organizations. The work disability may also be framed as a continuum in terms of managing work health over their employment cycle with the organization, which I'll talk about that in a moment. And that kind of is a very important aspect of this standard. The scope of this standard is to provide a framework for the management of work disability at organizational level. It specifies the requirements for work disability management processes to support organizations regardless of their size and sector, to ensure that they systematically manage their work disability management activities. As you can see in this slide, there are different components of this standard. Let me walk you through the main aspect of this standard. We have kind of two main sections here in this slide, the content, which outlines the requirement of the standard, which there are some mandatory requirements and some recommendations of best practices or evidence-informed practices. An informative annex, which are a non-mandatory guidance material to further support organization to implement the standard and better guide them to meet the requirements of this standard. So kind of quickly provide you an overview of topics covered within the course section or within the main clauses of the standard. I'll see here that the first stage of the implementation of the standard, we want to make sure that organizations build foundations necessary to be able to implement this standard. The WDM system is a framework that requires the organization to involve key stakeholders. That includes senior management, frontline managers, supervisors, internal subject matter experts, disability management specialists, healthcare professionals, and workers to engage in work disability management activities. And it is essential that roles and responsibilities are set and senior management commits to provide necessary resources to ensure that the standard and the system is implemented effectively. Then, as Emil highlighted, everything starts with the planning, and you want to make sure that organizations really plan for success. And how they do that, the standard provides some requirements to ensure organizations plan appropriately and be able to achieve their targets and objectives that they set here. So we want organizations to understand their strengths and identify improvement opportunities. We believe that organizations already have some practices that they could be useful, that they are perhaps working, and we want them to continue with those and perhaps improve them with additional steps that could possibly help them with implementation of a more systematic approach. We want organizations to develop a vision for future state, identify meaningful and achievable targets and objectives, and also doing so considering organizations' unique realities and capacity. And again, as I said, engage all key internal stakeholders and be able to communicate effectively with relevant external stakeholders. You want organizations then to go and fully implement changes that are important for the success of the system. You want them to look into their objectives and targets and make sure that all those changes, relevant changes, are implemented effectively by relevant stakeholders. So you want organizations to closely monitor rollout, to quickly identify problems or gaps, address those problems during implementation in a timely fashion, and also add these changes to the workforce and places of work immediately. Organizations may, right now, I believe all organizations are dealing with COVID-19 situation. How would this impacts your organization, and how, while you are in the implementation, be able to adopt new policies, new programs to ensure that you have an appropriate return to work strategy for those impacted workers. Last but not least, you want organization to evaluate their system and identify areas for improvement, and look into identifying those risks that will impact the success of the system. You want them to identify any nonconformities. You want them to ensure that the changes are appropriate to the size and the sector and the nature of the organization. And you may be using both qualitative and quantitative methods to identify the performance and identify your progress or the organization's progress towards achieving the requirements outlined in the standard. But you have to keep in mind that this is a very complex process, and you want to make sure that the tools you use to evaluate are sensitive enough to capture those important complexities. And at the end, you want to provide necessary input for decision making, as well as identifying lessons learned. Then on that continuum cycle of continuous improvement, you'll be able to address those issues next year where you are kind of implementing this standard. There are some guiding principles that they are the foundation of this standard. The standard is an evidence-informed, data-driven approach that is strategic in nature and focuses on inclusion and accessibility to promote engagement and belonging, and uses and utilizes worker-centered approach and supportive approach that is contextualized and case by case. Another aspect and another guiding principle for this standard is that it will promote accommodation and early return to work that considers the essential duties of the worker's role within organization. And also, the work disability management system is a joint responsibility between organization management, labor, worker representatives, where applicable, and also highlighting the importance of meeting legal compliance as applicable in a specific restrictions across Canada. I'm gonna kind of present this slide. This is really important as we're looking at the development of this standard. We looked into the whole employment cycle and looking to identifying factors that they are important for workers. You're looking at a continuum in terms of managing work at health over the whole employment life cycle of workers. You're looking at practices from recruitment, hiring, and onboarding through to job continuity and advancement to eventual departure from the organization. And this table highlights the relevant consideration for work disability management at each stage of employment, and we believe this is really important to consider when you are developing your work disability management system process. Last but not least, it is really important to acknowledge that this standard is adapted to the specific context of the organization and is applicable to organizations in Canada of any size and in any sector. It could be adopted by organizations, as I said, ranging from a small to large. And the fact that the standard has been developed in a way that could be scalable and could be implemented by organizations regardless of their maturity level, and has information that could possibly support organization if they want to proceed with more systematic approach towards work disability. We want to emphasize that the standard considers both physical and mental health needs of workers and as inclusive of visible and non-visible disabilities. This standard provides the what needs to be done, again, as I said, requirements, mandatory requirements, and also implementation as how you should go about implementing that clause and that requirement. As I said, a very important aspect of the standard is around the annexes and those recommendations and guidance material that they are provided to that they are available to provide additional support for organizations that they will be implementing this standard. And as I kind of mentioned again, the implementation tips provide a kind of a quick guidance of how this standard could be implemented. So that's the end of the broad overview of the standard. Now we have a panel discussion moderated by Candace. So Candace will moderate the questions, and Emil, Dr. David Brown, and myself will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Hey everybody, I'm just having a look at the chat and I see a question coming in. In disability management, can we consider any health problem which is caused due to work or due to repetitive work?
Emil, do you want to answer? I can answer.
Yeah,
that.
sure, I can start. And hopefully other people have something to contribute as well to this. It's meant to be comprehensive of all health needs of workers, the standard. As Amin pointed out, that it's whether it's mental health or physical health, visible disabilities or invisible disabilities, it's really meant to be proactive. So, the supervisors and managers play a critical role in assisting workers when they come forward asking for some accommodation because of their health needs. There needs to be a formal process in place within the organization and the roles and responsibility assigned to it. So whether it's physical or mental, visible or invisible, repetitive strain or an acute trauma type event, it could be work related, it could be non-work related. If it's something that may potentially affect the worker's level of engagement and performance while at work, it needs to be addressed proactively, and the standard is meant to help organizations develop a very systematized approach to dealing with these kinds of issues on a proactive basis.
Amin or David, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I would just say that this really sort of falls under the bucket of the continuity and advancement. So we have somebody in the organization, we try to adapt to their needs as they join the organization, and something comes along untoward that sends them on a different path. And what we would need to do is be sensitive and to try and be supportive and help them on a productive path. So whether that's work related, arising out of work, or something else, really the standard rises above that, and that's where I would see that. And so I would take you back to the principles, because I think this is where a lot of this stuff, where the rubber meets the road. We've discussed the breadth of the standard, But really, what we're saying is a particular individual in this case has run into an issue, and so putting the correct supports around them is the way to move forward. And by the way, this is a joint ownership. I want to really stress this, that both management and the worker own this together. And so if there's an issue arising or somebody's aware of something, they really should escalate the issue, and then it sort of falls to management and the whole group to work together to resolve that and make the issue lesser or make it go away entirely. So when these questions arise, I would say look at the scope of the standard, and then look to the guiding principles as to where the focus might lie.
Thank you, David. I'm going to move on to, we have another question on Q&A from Catherine. Does the standard have recommendations related to outsourcing of disability management? And I'm going to put that out to Emil.
Okay, sir, thank you. Okay, so we know the standard is really describing how the organization works internally and also how it connects to external experts too. But the main focus of the standard is the roles and responsibilities within the organization and how that dovetails also with external service and stuff. So it doesn't have a strong commentary about outsourcing, but it doesn't absolve the organization from thinking that they don't play a role in that. They have to play an active role. It is a management system standard, so it really focuses on what the management system within the organization needs to do to be proactively addressing these needs. Most certainly, they need to sometimes outsource expertise that they don't have in-house. That's a very common practice for a whole range of things that an organization needs to oversee in order to meet their objectives, kind of thing. So it's not really speaking to whether everything has to be in-house or whether things can be outsourced. Small organizations may not have all of the expertise in-house, so may need to reach out, but certainly that doesn't absolve them of responsibility of being proactive and players in work disability management within their organization.
Sorry, Candace, I just want to add here that it is very important, as Emil highlighted, to ensure that we build capacity within organizations to be able to work effectively with internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. But you want to make sure that organizations really build that foundation and that structure within their current practices to be able to address work disability issues effectively and in a systematic way. Again, as Emil's highlighted, it kind of the standard really focuses on providing that providing recommendations to build that capacity, and also has information on how you have to engage with some of the external relevant external stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Amin. We have a question from Drew. What would you say is the most challenging component to the implementation of the standard? I'm going to put this one out to David to start.
Thank you. I think so this disability management has been sort of growing in the wild for a long time, shall we say. And there are very disparate views about what's in, what's out, what's included, what's not, what practices are and whatnot. So everybody sort of thinks of disability management and it means something different to everybody. What this...
I think we might have lost David. Can anybody hear me? Amin, Emil?
I can.
Okay, well, why don't we move over? Amin, you can take a stab while while David gets his audio back.
Sure, I tried to use a different approach. Then we saved that approach for David. I believe everything starts with that preparation phase. Like, to me, having management commit and senior management commit and get on board with the implementation aspect of this standard, that's critical, and that's the key for success. Making sure that senior management is fully on board, provides required and necessary resources is very important and is very critical for the success. So again, as I said, we want to make sure that organizations really build capacity we acknowledge that it may take years for organizations to be able to fully implement different aspects of the standard and on all aspects of the standard, but everything starts with making sure that management is committed for the implementation of this standard.
Yeah. And that really, to me, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. Buy-in by senior management, all levels of management, really critical. I think another challenge I can see, you know, and maybe every organization has, you know, different experiences with these kinds of things, but is realizing that everybody plays a role. Like this isn't some one person's role in HR or the disability manager, occupational health and safety manager. And we have a lot of priors about this when historically it was really just a function rather than a management system. And I think wrapping your mind around that idea, that has to be woven into the management system where everybody plays some role in it. You know, the operations manager plays some role in making sure the people who work with them are accommodated appropriately when they have health needs that arise, and do that in a proactive basis rather than thinking that, well, that's somebody else's job to do. So everybody plays a role, and that's what the management system is about. And just maybe putting aside all the priors and trying to rethink how you can be more proactive as an organization is sometimes a challenge at the front end.
Great, thank you, Emil. I have a question that I'd like to share with everybody. We've seen for other standards, for example, the National Standard on Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace, the Mental Health Commission of Canada did a baseline study. Are there any plans, Emil, to follow an organization through the implementation of the standard and get an idea of live what the challenges and opportunities are?
It's David, I'm back. I'm sorry I got ejected.
Welcome back, David.
I take it somebody answered the question.
we did it for you, David, so we're here for you. So just to get, and Min and I both have been thinking a lot about this too, that we definitely like to be out there in the field, evaluating implementation, uptake, performance, you know, and any kind of other issues that arise as organizations go forward with this standard. I think it's really critical to develop that evidence base, you know, especially with the early starters, you know, the decision leaders who can may influence, you know, down the road other organizations to follow suit and help them actually do that as well. So I think it would be really great to build up that evidence base, much like was done with the Z1003, to have some, you know, pilot projects out there to see how well it's working and help identify, you know, maybe there might be some glitches on implementation, that develop some better guidance to help with other organizations doing it. There's such a diversity out there, you know, from small business may have different challenges than larger organizations. So we really need to think about the context and how we can help support uptake in different contexts.
Great, thank you. Min, did you want to add anything to that?
Okay.
You're good? Okay. I have another question. How does the standard encourage employers and workers to work together for the best outcomes? David, would you like to try that before we lose you again?
So yeah, I was just going to start where I left off before, which is it provides the common language and a way of focusing. So when often the needs may seem disparate, that management wants thus and so, the worker and workers' representatives want thus and so. But in point of fact, we're all actually working towards the same thing, because healthy workers and engaged in an inclusive program is a huge thing for corporate productivity and profitability, if you want to get right down to it. And so really the standard gives us the vehicle to come in and say, okay, here's something we can work on. We may not want to take on the whole thing right in one go, but let's start here. And it's a vehicle that we can jump into together and be guided by the outline of the standard, and then build from there, knowing that the jigsaw pieces are going to fit as you move on.
Great, thank you, David. And Min, would you like to add anything?
No, yeah, and again, the standard really outlines effective strategies that help organizations to build that collaborative spirit within the key internal stakeholders for disability, we kind of what we have in this standard is some requirements that provides guidance for employers and workers on best practices that could facilitate that collaborative working relationship between these important stakeholders.
Thank you. Emil, would you like to add anything? This is our final question.
Yeah, okay, for sure. Okay, so while it's meant to be, as Min has pointed out, collaborative, the worker plays a critical role. It's a jointly managed process kind of thing, worker-centered, as we said, so that it really is meant to keep the worker engaged, play an active role in identifying the solutions with their supervisors, their managers, kind of thing, and together it's meant to be a win-win. If you do it in a proactive, collaborative way, the solutions are good for the worker and keep them engaged, productive, and it's good for the organization because they're less loss of productivity when issues arise, kind of thing, because they're addressed proactively and immediately rather than let them linger and wait till you have to put out a fire, kind of thing. So it is meant to be a win-win where workers and management are working together to find solutions on a proactive basis.
Well, thank you, Emil. And in concluding the question and answer portion of today's webinar, I'd like to just share an observation from Wanda Deschamps in the chat window. And she said, "This is our opportunity to move forward together in the inclusion revolution and bring all of our disability community members in full participation in our workforce. Yes, to view of physical and mental health. Remember, 80% plus of disabilities are invisible." And thank you for that thought, Wanda. I certainly agree with you wholeheartedly. And I'm going to hand it back to Amin and Emil to wrap up today's webinar.
Thank you, Candace. I would like to thank everyone that attended this webinar. I would like to thank CSA Groups for supporting this webinar and our partner for this work, Center for Research on Work Disability Policy. I know that there were a lot of information to digest. We do have other webinars on this topic hosted by CRWDP and CISWP. For each of the topics, we are hosting 2 webinars to accommodate everyone's schedule, as we recognize that there might be some challenges for people to join on a specific date. So we are providing webinars in 2 different days for each topic, and we'll have a diverse panelist to help us discuss further some aspect of the standard from different perspectives.
Yeah, let me just add also that we'll try to bring something new with each of them, sort of thing. So you're welcome to join both of them in a month, kind of thing. So there'll be possibly different panelists, different angles taken on the issue, so that there are some fresh ideas being presented with each session.
Perfect. Thank you. At the end, again, I would like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. We'll see you next time.